The woman behind the counter grabbed Elena's arm and dragged her to the door. The next thing she knew, she was on her knees in the dirt, palms bleeding, the door slamming shut behind her. 6 years. 6 years of running from a crime she never committed. 6 years of being invisible, unwanted, and alone. She pushed herself up to leave. Walking was all she knew how to do anymore. Then she felt it, a small, warm hand sliding into hers. She looked down into the face of a 7-year-old girl with eyes as blue as summer sky. "You're bleeding," the little girl said. "Do you want to meet my daddy? He's real nice." Every warning bell in Elena's head screamed to run. Kindness from strangers was always a trap. There was always a price. But she couldn't say no. She had no idea that this child would lead her to a dead woman's secret, a conspiracy that destroyed families, and the truth that would finally set her free. This story will teach you that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop running. That home isn't a place you find. It's something you build with the people who believe you deserve to stay. If you've ever felt invisible, unwanted, or like the world has already decided who you are, this story is your proof that second chances are real. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever had a stranger change your life? Your likes and shares help women everywhere find stories that remind them they are worth fighting for. Subscribe so you never miss a story that speaks to your soul. The Wyoming sun was relentless that day. Elena kept her head down, trying to make herself invisible, a skill she'd learned the hard way. Her old dress was the color of a bad bruise, and the dust of the road had become a second skin. She walked on boots, held together by sheer will, the blisters on her feet having given up hours ago. Her stomach had gone quiet, a sure sign she was running on empty. Ridgefield was just a speck on the map, maybe 300 souls all told. But it had a diner with a faded help wanted sign, and that was enough for her. The bell on the door sounded way too cheerful for the life she was living. Inside, it smelled of coffee and fried bacon. A few ranch hands at the counter stopped talking and sized her up the second she walked in. They saw the dirt, the desperation, and the broken way she carried herself. The woman behind the counter had a face like stone and hair pulled back tight. Her expression went from sour to worse in a heartbeat. "We're not hiring," she said, her voice flat. Elena's own voice was barely a whisper. "But the sign." The woman's tone was final. "Sign came down yesterday. Nothing for you here." One of the men at the counter chuckled. Another one mumbled something ugly under his breath, and a wave of mean laughter followed. "Please," Elena begged, hating the sound of the word. "I can wash dishes, anything." I said no. The woman came around the counter, grabbed Elena's arm with fingers like steel, and dragged her to the door. Elena was too worn out to even fight back. The next thing she knew, she was on the ground, the door slamming shut as her palms scraped against the hard-packed dirt. She just knelt there for a moment, breathing in the dust and the shame. For 6 years it had been like this. She pushed herself up, her hands trembling. The street was quiet. At least nobody saw her fall. That was the only kindness the day had offered so far. Elena turned to leave, to get back to the only thing she knew how to do. Walk. That's when she felt it. A small, warm hand slid right into hers. She looked down into the face of a little girl, no older than 7. The child had a sweet, freckled face and eyes as blue as a summer sky. She was barefoot, her toes covered in dust. "You're bleeding," the little girl said, pointing to Elena's scraped hands. Elena quickly pulled her hand away. "I am fine." The little girl just tilted her head, seeing right through the lie. "You don't look fine. You look hungry." As if on cue, Elena's stomach rumbled. The girl's eyes went wide. "I knew it," she said, reaching out again. "Do you want to meet my daddy? He's real nice. And our housekeeper, Miss Sarah, she makes the best biscuits with honey butter." Every warning bell in Elena's head went off. Kindness from strangers was usually a trap. There was always a price to pay. But this little girl looked at her with such simple, honest goodness. Elena felt a crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. She couldn't find the words to say no. The little girl held on tight. "I'm Lucy. Lucy Hale. What's your name?" Elena knew she should give a fake name. She had a dozen of them ready. But looking into those clear blue eyes, the truth just slipped out. Elena. Lucy's face lit up like the 4th of July. "That is a pretty name. Come on, Elena. Our ranch is just down the road." And just like that, Elena, who trusted no one, let the little girl lead her away. It was the first time in 6 years she had chosen to stop running. Her mind raced with all the bad things that could happen. Lucy's father would see the trouble clinging to her like dust and send her packing. Or even worse, he might recognize her name. He might remember the stories from 6 years back, the trial that ruined her life for a crime she never committed. But Lucy just chattered away as they walked. "Daddy says not to talk to strangers, but you don't feel like a stranger. You feel like someone who needs a friend." The little girl's words were a sharp, sweet pain. "My mama died when I was just a baby. I don't remember much, just that she smelled like lavender. Daddy gets real quiet now. Sometimes at night I hear him walking the floors, and I know he's thinking about her." Elena wanted to warn the girl to be more careful with her heart, that the world wasn't always kind. But she stayed quiet, just listening. They left the town behind, following a simple dirt road through the sagebrush. Out here, the air was clean and smelled of pine from the mountains. Soon, a ranch came into view. It was a simple 2-story house painted white a long time ago, with a big, sturdy barn beside it. A dozen horses stood in a corral, their coats shining in the sun. The place looked humble but cared for, built by someone who wasn't afraid of hard work. "That's home," Lucy said with a proud little smile. "Daddy's probably in the barn. He's always working." As they got closer, crossing a yard with a neat vegetable garden, Elena could hear the steady clang of a hammer on metal. It was a strong, sure sound. Lucy dropped Elena's hand and ran ahead, her small voice calling out into the dim light of the barn, and pulled her along. "Daddy! Daddy, I brought somebody!" The sound of hammering stopped. Elena's steps got slower. Every bone in her body screamed at her to turn and run. This was it. She knew this dance by heart. First the suspicion, then the knowing look, and finally, the rejection. A man walked out of the barn, and Elena forgot how to breathe. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with dark hair that needed a trim. His face looked like it had given up on smiling a long time ago. He wore plain work clothes, and the sleeves of his shirt were rolled up, showing off strong forearms covered in old scars. His hands were rough and capable, the kind that knew how to build things and fix things, the kind that didn't stop until a job was done. But his eyes were what got her. They were a deep brown, nearly black, and filled with a weariness she saw in her own reflection. They were the eyes of a man who had seen loss and learned to live with it, but never truly got over it. He looked at Lucy, and his face softened just a little. Then his eyes fell on Elena, and the softness vanished. "Lucy." His voice was deep and steady. "Who is this?" "This is Elena. She fell down in town, and she is hungry, and her hands are bleeding. I told her Miss Sarah makes the best biscuits, and she could come home with me. Can she please stay for supper?" The man, who Elena guessed was Jacob Hale, looked her over so hard she felt like shrinking away. She saw him notice her worn-out dress, her beat-up boots, and how thin she was from too many skipped meals. His jaw clenched. "Lucy, you go on inside and get washed up, but Daddy, now please." The little girl's face fell, but she did as she was told. She gave Elena one last worried look before heading to the house. The silence that followed felt heavy. Jacob Hale crossed his arms, putting up a wall between them. "I do not know what my daughter told you," he said in a low voice, "but we are not in the habit of taking in strays. She did not tell me anything." Elena's voice was raspier than she meant for it to be. I did not ask to come here. My daughter has a big heart and not an ounce of sense about danger. His voice got sharper. That means I have got to have enough for the both of us. Elena nodded and started to turn away. I understand. I will go. Wait. She froze, but she did not turn back around. She would not let him see the disappointment on her face. She heard him let out a long, tired breath. Lucy does not bring people home, ever. The fact that she brought you... He stopped for a second. When he spoke again, his voice was a little softer. You can stay for supper. One meal, then you head on out. We clear? Elena turned slow. I don't need a handout. I did not say you did. But my little girl asked, and I do not tell her no without good cause. His eyes got sharp. You on the run from something? The question landed hard. Lying was easy for her now, but his steady look pulled out a different kind of truth. From everything, she said, her voice low. For 6 years. She watched him weigh the words, figure the risk. Finally, he gave one short nod. One meal. You are gone before the sun is up. Understood. And Elena? He waited for her to look at him. Lucy has had her share of heartache. You keep your trouble clear of her. We clear on that? Yes. He held her gaze, then headed for the barn. Sarah is fixing supper. Be ready in an hour. The house is that way. Wash up first. He vanished inside, leaving Elena standing in the dusty yard as shadows stretched long. She ought to just walk away. Before the little girl's hope soured, before Jacob gave her that look she knew so well, but her feet took her to the house. Toward one good meal, one night off the hard ground. One evening of make-believe, where she was someone who earned a little kindness. Just tonight, she promised herself. Then she would be gone. She could not know that one night would stretch into the start of a life she had forgotten how to dream of. The house was bigger than it looked, with simple, sturdy furniture. A worn-out couch, faded chairs, and a rocker by the fire worn smooth from years of use. It was all clean but comfortable. Lucy popped out of the kitchen, her face bright. You stayed. I knew it. Come on, I will show you where to clean up. She led Elena to a little washroom with a basin, a pitcher of water, and clean towels. Miss Sarah left these for you, Lucy said. She says you cannot think right with a dirty face and a hungry belly. I will let her know you are here. The girl was gone in a flash, her bare feet thumping on the wood floors. Elena shut the door and just stood there for a moment, looking at herself in the little mirror. The woman looking back was a stranger. She was thin, with haunted eyes, a streak of dirt on her cheek, and her hair falling out of its tie. She looked just like what she was, someone who had learned the hard way that the world chews you up and spits you out. She poured some water into the basin and scrubbed her hands. She watched the water turn dirty brown, then pink from the scrapes on her palms. The soap smelled clean and sharp, like rosemary. After she had washed her face and hands and fixed her hair, she still looked like she did not belong. But at least she looked like she had made an effort. The kitchen was warm and smelled wonderful. A woman was standing at the stove. She was maybe 20 years older than Jacob, with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. She had a sturdy look about her, like she was used to hard work. She turned when Elena came in, her dark eyes sizing her up without any judgment. You must be Elena. I am Sarah. Her voice was kind but firm. Lucy tells me you have had a rough go of it today. That is one way to say it. A small smile touched Sarah's lips. Well, supper is about ready. You can make yourself useful and set the table. Plates are in that cabinet there, and the silverware is in the drawer. Elena was glad to have something to do. It felt good to earn her keep, even just for one night. She set out 4 places at the big wooden table. The plates and cups did not match, the kind of collection a family gathers over the years. Lucy came back in, wearing clean clothes and with her hair a little less wild. Can Elena sit by me, Miss Sarah? That is for your daddy to decide. Just then, Jacob appeared in the doorway. He had washed up, and his hair was still damp. He had put on a clean shirt, And without the barn dust, Elena could see the strong line of his jaw and the tired lines around his mouth. He moved with a kind of careful stillness, like a man who kept all his feelings locked up tight inside. His eyes went straight to Elena, looking her over again. Then he pointed to the table. "Lucy, you sit there. Elena can take that seat." They all sat down. Sarah brought the food over. There was roasted chicken, potatoes, green beans, and fresh-baked bread that steamed when she cut it. It was more food than Elena had seen in a long, long time. Jacob did not say grace. He just started filling Lucy's plate, then motioned for Sarah and Elena to serve themselves. It was all quiet and practical. Elena took only a little bit of everything, knowing her stomach could not handle much. But it tasted like heaven. Lucy did enough talking for the whole table. She chattered on about a new foal in the barn, her math lesson with Miss Sarah, and a hawk she had seen flying over the creek. She talked mostly to Elena, pulling her into the family circle so naturally it was easy to forget they had just met. Jacob did not say much, but Elena saw how he watched his daughter. She saw the love in his eyes and the hint of a smile when Lucy got excited about something. It was plain to see he loved that little girl more than anything. Sarah asked a few gentle questions about where Elena was from and how long she had been traveling. Elena gave vague answers, telling just enough of the truth to get by without giving away her real story. After the plates were cleared, Lucy started yawning, her eyes getting heavy. "Bedtime, little one," Sarah said warmly. "Say your good nights." Lucy gave Sarah a hug, then went to her father. Jacob pulled her onto his lap for a tight hug, arms holding her tight, his hand gentle in her messy hair. "Sleep tight, sweetheart." Then Lucy launched herself at Elena, wrapping her arms around her waist in a surprisingly strong hug. "I am so glad you stayed," Lucy whispered. Elena's throat went tight. She patted the girl's back, clumsy, unused to a kindness that did not have a price. After Sarah led Lucy off, a heavy silence fell in the kitchen. Jacob started clearing plates. Elena stood to help, but he just shook his head. "You have done your part. I should be going." She headed for the door. "Thanks for the... And just where do you think you are going?" His voice was low, but stopped her cold. "Back to town. They were not exactly rolling out the welcome mat for you." She kept her back to him. "I will get by. I reckon you will. You look like you have had plenty of practice." He set down a dish, and she heard him step closer. "But Lucy will ask for you come morning. And I am not about to tell my girl I sent a woman out into the dark with no place to go." Elena turned around slow. "You said one meal." "I did," he said, his gaze steady. But something had changed in his eyes. "I am changing the terms. You can take the spare room tonight. We will sort out the rest tomorrow. I do not need..." Sarah could use a hand, he said, talking right over her. "The garden needs seeing to. The chickens need feeding. There is always more chores than people. You can stay on, work for your board. When it is time to go, you will have a full belly and cash in your pocket." Elena just stared, looking for the catch. But all she saw on his face was bone-deep tiredness, and maybe a little compassion. "Why?" she finally asked. "Because my daughter asked. And because..." He paused for a second. "Because 6 years is a powerful long time to be running from everything. Maybe you have earned a chance to just stand still." The word struck her harder than a fist. She felt a wall inside her crack just a little. "A few days," she heard herself agree. "Then I am gone." "Fair enough." He nodded down the hall. "Second door on the right. Blankets are in the chest. We are up at dawn. I will be ready." He gave her one last look, then went back to the sink. Elena walked down the hall, feeling like she was in a dream. The room was small and clean, with a bed, a dresser, and a window facing the mountains. It was more than she had had in 6 long years. She sat on the bed and finally let the shakes take over. A man had offered her kindness when he had no reason to, and for some reason she had said yes. She heard Lucy's sleepy voice through the wall, then Sarah's soft reply, then quiet. Lying back, she stared at the ceiling. For the first time in forever, She let herself wonder what it would be like to stay. The idea was scarier than anything she had faced on the road. But she was here, and tomorrow was coming. Outside, the stars came out, bright and clear in the big, dark sky. Elena closed her eyes, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she slept deep, with no dreams of running. The blue light of dawn woke her to a rooster crowing. For a second, she had no idea where she was. Then she felt the quilt, and remembered she had slept the whole night through. Her body ached from a real bed after so long on the ground. Outside, Jacob was already heading for the barn. In the kitchen, Sarah was kneading dough flour on her hands. "Morning," she said, not even looking up. "Coffee is hot. Then go get the eggs." She did not ask questions, just put Elena to work. Elena took a basket out into the crisp air and collected 17 eggs. Back inside, Sarah pointed to a hot pan. "Scramble them. Lucy likes hers soft. Jacob likes them firm. You can have yours how you like." Cooking for other people felt strange, but her hands knew what to do. Lucy ran in, wild-haired and barefoot. "You are still here. I told Daddy you would be." "Lucy." Jacob's voice came from the door, gentle but firm. "Let the woman breathe." Elena saw he looked worn out, like a man carrying a heavy load all on his own. That coffee was strong enough to peel paint right off a wall. Elena grabbed the basket and stepped into the crisp morning air. The sun was just coming over the ridge, turning everything a warm gold. She gathered 17 eggs from the chicken coop, some still warm to the touch. Inside, Sarah pointed to a hot skillet on the stove. "Scramble those," she said. "Lucy likes them soft, and Jacob likes them firm. You can make yours however you want." Elena cracked the eggs, the simple task feeling foreign after all this time. Her hands remembered what to do, even if her heart had forgotten what it felt like to belong somewhere. Just then, Lucy came running in like a small tornado, her hair a mess and her feet still bare. "Elena, you stayed. I told Daddy you would, but he said not to get my hopes up, but I just knew it." Jacob's voice, gentle but firm, came from the doorway. "Lucy, give the woman some room." He looked worn out, the deep lines around his eyes telling her he hadn't slept well at all. Jacob watched her for a spell before he walked over, his boots quiet in the soft dirt of the garden. "You handle that hoe like you were born with it." Elena kept her eyes on the weeds. "I told Miss Sarah I knew my way around a garden." Jacob's voice was low and steady. "I need to know if trouble's following you here. My daughter brought you onto this land. That makes it my business." Elena stood up slow, brushing the soil from her worn hands. She finally met his gaze. "6 years ago, I was accused of stealing from the family I worked for. They said I took a ruby necklace. I never laid eyes on it before they found it tucked in my shawl. I was innocent, but it didn't make a lick of difference. They had witnesses and a story that held. I spent 3 years in a women's prison up in Colorado. By the time I got out, my father was gone. His farm was sold off to pay taxes I couldn't cover from a prison cell. Ever since, I've just been moving. Staying in one place too long means folks find out, and I lose whatever work I've found." She crossed her arms, her voice hard as stone. "That's the trouble that follows me, mister. A conviction that was a lie, and 3 years of my life I can't ever get back." Jacob studied her face for a long time, his own expression unreadable. "I believe you," he said, and the simple words nearly knocked her over. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because I've heard enough tall tales to know the truth when it's spoken plain. And because," he paused, his gaze drifting toward the quiet house, "sometimes the world just chews up good people and spits them out." A shadow crossed his face, something deep and old. "My wife, Margaret. She passed 3 years back. The doctor called it consumption. But I saw the fear in her eyes those last few months. She was scared of something fierce, and she took that secret with her to the grave." He shook his head as if to clear it. "It don't matter now. What's done is done. He turned and walked back toward the barn, leaving Elena standing amongst the vegetables with more questions than answers. Later that afternoon, Elena sat on the porch, mending one of Jacob's shirts. The steady rhythm of the needle and thread was a small comfort. It was a skill she learned in prison, taking something broken and making it useful again. She could hear young Lucy chattering inside, a bright spot in the heavy silence of the ranch. The peace was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Two men rode into the yard, both wearing the sheriff's star. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Every part of her screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. Jacob came out of the barn, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. The older lawman, Sheriff Porter, swung down from his horse. He was the same man who'd ignored her letters from prison. "Jacob," the sheriff said, his voice friendly but with an edge. "Something I can help you with?" Jacob asked, positioning himself between the men in the house. The younger deputy pointed a thumb toward the porch. "Heard you had some new help. Who's that?" "Just a woman passing through, earning her keep," Jacob said, his voice flat. "We heard a woman caused a ruckus down at the diner yesterday," Porter said, his eyes narrowing as he finally got a good look at Elena. "Just like to know who's in our county. Make sure they ain't got warrants." Jacob didn't budge. "She's working for me. There's no trouble here." Porter wasn't satisfied. He started walking toward the porch, his spurs jingling with each step. Elena forced her hands to stay steady on the shirt in her lap. "What's your name, miss?" he asked, his voice ringing with authority. Elena lifted her chin, her voice clear and steady despite the fear coiling in her gut. "My name is Elena Cross." She saw the flicker of recognition in the sheriff's eyes. He remembered. He remembered the trial, the girl he'd helped send away, and the ruby necklace that had ruined her life. The afternoon sun suddenly felt cold, and the quiet porch became the most dangerous place on earth. "Cross. Thought that was you," he said, but his smile was cold as a stone. "You're a mighty long way from Colorado." Her voice was steady, though her heart was pounding in her chest. "I've been released. Served my time." "Released, sure," he sneered. "But that don't mean folks want you around. Once a thief, always a thief." He looked straight at Jacob. "You know what she is." Jacob's voice turned hard. "I know what she was convicted of. I also know she's earning her keep on my land and not causing a bit of trouble. Unless you have actual business here, Sheriff, I'm busy." Porter's gaze shifted between them. "Just making sure you know who you're letting into your home. You've got a young daughter, Jacob. You ought to think about that." Jacob's voice dropped low and dangerous. "I don't need your advice on raising my daughter. And I don't appreciate you coming on my property to give it. Elena is working here legally, so you can leave." The tension was thick enough to cut. Finally, Porter shrugged. "Your choice. But don't come crying when things go missing." He got back on his horse and they rode away slow, making sure their presence lingered. Jacob waited until they were gone before he turned to Elena. She was just sitting there, frozen. "I should go," she said quietly, "before I cause you more trouble." "Sit down, Elena." "You heard him. I said sit down." He walked up the porch steps and sat in the chair next to her. "Porter's been looking for an excuse to mess with me ever since Margaret died. This isn't about you." "Why would he have a problem with you?" Jacob stared out at the empty road for a long moment. "Because I asked too many questions about how Margaret died. About why she was so scared in her last few months. Porter told me to let it go." "What kind of questions?" she asked. "About who she was talking to, about the men she said were watching the house, and about some papers she kept hidden out in the barn." He clenched his fists. "Those papers disappeared the day after she passed. She tried to tell me something was wrong, but I thought it was just the fever talking. By the time I realized she was serious, it was too late." "What was in the papers?" "I don't know. I never saw them. She told me where to find them if anything happened, but when I looked, they were gone." Elena's mind started putting the pieces together. A scared woman who died, papers that vanished into thin air, a sheriff who wanted everyone to be quiet. It didn't make a perfect picture, but it was the outline of something terrible. "The land grab," she said softly, remembering whispers she'd heard on the road. "I heard stories about corrupt land deals, families losing their farms." Jacob nodded grimly. Margaret's family had good land. After she died, some men showed up saying the deed was no good, that the land belonged to a big company. I fought it in court, but I lost half our property in 6 months. His voice was full of bitterness. And Porter was there at every hearing, making sure I kept my mouth shut and accepted the ruling. "You think it's all connected?" "I think my wife knew something that got her killed," he said, looking right at Elena. "And I think the folks responsible made sure no one would believe a dying woman. I think Porter knows exactly what happened and has been covering it up from the very start." The heavy truth of it all settled between them. They were two people who had lost everything because of truths nobody wanted to hear. "I can't help you," Elena said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm nobody, just an ex-convict. If I start asking questions, they'll run me out of town. Or worse." "I'm not asking you to help," he said. "I'm asking you to understand why I don't give a damn what Sheriff Porter thinks about who I hire." He met her gaze. "You did time for something you didn't do. My wife died trying to expose something evil. We both know the law doesn't always mean justice. So when he comes on my land trying to scare you, I won't let him run you off just because it's easier for him." For the first time in a long time, Elena felt a crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. "Why do you care?" "Because my daughter brought you here," he said. "And because sometimes standing up for someone else is the only way you can remember you're still a good person." Just then, Lucy ran out the door. "Elena, can you help me feed the chickens?" Elena looked at the little girl, then back at Jacob. "Yes," she said, "I'll help." As Lucy pulled her toward the chicken coop, chattering away, Elena felt Jacob's eyes on her. A silent promise seemed to pass between them. That evening, after Lucy was in bed, Elena found herself back on the porch. The sky was clear, filled with stars. She knew she should be planning her next move, figuring out where to go. But instead, she was thinking about how much harder it would be to leave now than it was to stay. Jacob came out with 2 cups of coffee, still hot. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "Haven't really slept well in 6 years," she admitted. He sat down beside her, looking weary to his bones. "Lucy asked me tonight if you were going to stay. I told her I didn't know. I'll just break her heart when I leave." "Probably," he said, sipping his coffee. "But she's a tough little girl. Sarah thinks you should stay too. Says you're a hard worker." He paused. "What do you think?" He was quiet for a long while before he answered. "I think you've been running for so long you've forgotten how to stand still. I think whatever happened 6 years ago broke something inside you. And I think," he paused again, "I think maybe you need to stay in one place long enough to remember who you were before the world told you who you had to be." His words hit her hard. Elena felt the burn of tears and fought them back. "I don't know if that person even exists anymore," she whispered. "There's only one way to find out." They sat there in the quiet, listening to the sounds of the ranch at night. An owl hooted from the barn, and a coyote howled in the distance. "I was someone's daughter once," Elena said finally, her voice soft. "I had a future. It wasn't anything grand, but it was mine. Then one day it all just vanished." "The world only cares about what it can take from you," Elena said, her voice flat. "It does not care about your plans or your truth." "That is not the whole world," Jacob replied softly. "That is just the part that got its hooks in you. It is the only part I have seen for 6 years. Then you have been looking in the wrong corners." She studied his face in the starlight. "They took your wife. They took your land. And you are out here raising a little girl by yourself. How can you still see any good in this world?" "Because of Lucy," he said, meeting her gaze. "She is a daily reminder that having hope does not make you a fool. And if I let what they did to Margaret make me bitter, then they do not just win once. They win twice. They get her life, and they get mine, too. I will not hand them that. Elena wanted to believe him, to think this ranch could be a real home, not just another place to hide. But trusting someone felt like a gamble she could not afford. I do not know how, she whispered. How to just stay. Most days I do not either, Jacob said, standing up with her empty cup. But we get up and do it. Get some sleep. We are mending fence down south tomorrow. I could use the help, he added before going inside. He left her there under the big Texas sky with a choice that weighed a ton. She could run like she always did, or she could take a chance. For 6 long years, being smart and safe had kept her alive, but it had not gotten her anywhere she wanted to be. She sat on that porch until the stars started to give way to the dawn, fighting a new kind of fear, the fear that she had finally found a place that might ask her to stay. 3 weeks later, she was gathering eggs when it hit her. With her hand reaching under a warm hen, she froze. She realized she had not thought about the next town or the fastest road out in days. The thought did not bring panic, just a quiet warmth. She had stopped planning her escape because somewhere between mending Jacob's shirts and showing Lucy how to braid her hair, the ranch had started to feel like home. The daily rhythm of chores had settled into her bones. She worked alongside Sarah in the mornings and helped Jacob with repairs around the property. In the afternoons, she taught Lucy her numbers. The nights were quiet, and for the first time in years, she slept without one eye open. But that morning, the air felt thick and heavy. A strange stillness hung over the land. Sarah saw it too, standing on the porch, staring at the horizon. "Storm is coming," she said, her voice low. "A bad one. We need to batten down the hatches." So they spent the morning getting ready, bringing in the tools. As they worked, Jacob was quiet and wound tight, like the storm was the least of his worries. A nervous Lucy stuck to Elena's side, talking a mile a minute about lightning and whether the barn cats would be all right. Elena tried to soothe the little girl, making promises she hoped the sky would keep. By midday, the wind was howling. Elena was tying down the last of the tools when Jacob came up to her, his face like a thundercloud. "I need your help in the barn," he said. His tone told her it had nothing to do with the weather. She followed him into the dim quiet of the barn, where the horses stomped in their stalls. He led her to a back wall that looked like any other, then pressed on one of the boards. With a soft click, a piece of the wall swung open, showing a dark, empty space. "This was Margaret's," Jacob said, his voice barely a whisper. "She told me about it right before she passed, but it was empty when I looked." Elena's heart hammered in her chest. "Why show me?" "Because I was wrong," he said. "I do not think someone took the papers. I think she moved them. She was scared, and she put them somewhere I would never find." He traced the edges of the empty hole. "I have turned this whole barn upside down 100 times. Nothing." "Maybe she got rid of them," Elena suggested. "No," he said, his voice hard as iron. "She made me swear on Lucy's life I would find them. She would not have done that if they were gone." As thunder rolled outside, Elena thought about the hidden space. If she moved them, Elena said, it would be to a place that meant something to her, a place you might overlook. "I have looked everywhere," he said, his jaw tight. "The house, the garden, her favorite spot by the creek. Everywhere." Elena thought about the Margaret she had come to know through stories, a woman of quiet strength and deep love. "Besides you and Lucy, what did she love to do?" Jacob paused. "Her quilts," he said finally. "She was always stitching. Said it helped her think." His eyes suddenly lit up with a new idea. "There is a trunk of them in the attic. Her quilts, her mama's, one's for Lucy. Did you ever look through them?" "No," he admitted, his voice rough. "I could not bring myself to touch her things after." Sarah packed them up. He was already heading for the ladder to the loft. "I guess I was never ready." They climbed up into the hot, dusty attic, a place filled with forgotten things and old memories. A big cedar chest sat quiet in the corner, a monument to a grief Jacob had avoided for 3 long years. He finally knelt down, his hands shaking just above the latch. Elena watched him steel himself, knowing that opening that box meant facing it all. The lid groaned open. Inside lay a lifetime of quilts, folded just so. Jacob lifted them out, one by one, his hands gentle as if touching a memory. He could almost hear his wife, Margaret, humming as she stitched scraps into beauty. Near the bottom, Elena noticed one quilt felt different. It was heavier, with something stiff sewn inside. Her eyes met Jacob's. This was the one. He unfolded it to show a beautiful wedding ring pattern. As he ran his hand over the top, he found it too. A small patch of clumsy stitches, nothing like Margaret's careful work. With a small knife, he carefully cut the threads and pulled out an oilskin bundle. Just then, thunder rattled the old barn. The storm was here. Jacob's hands trembled as he opened the bundle. Inside were legal papers, letters, and a journal filled with Margaret's neat handwriting. He spread them across the chest lid. What Elena read over his shoulder made her blood run cold. It was all there. Forged deeds, letters between Sheriff Porter and a lawyer named Coleman, and a list of families who had lost their land. It was a whole criminal operation, a conspiracy to steal land from good people. The scheme was run by 3 men, Coleman the lawyer, Porter the sheriff, and a judge named Marcus Webb. They used the law itself as a weapon. Margaret had figured it all out when they came for her family's land. She had started digging, quietly gathering proof of their crimes. She had documented everything. She had found the original deeds that proved the forgeries, and had copies of their letters. At the bottom of the pile was a letter for Jacob, written 2 days before she died. He unfolded it, his face a storm of grief and rage as he read. When he was done, he handed it to Elena. The letter explained everything. Coleman had visited Margaret, threatening her to stop her investigation. He had brought her a cup of tea and insisted she drink it. She fell ill that very night. The doctor called it consumption, but she knew better. They were poisoning her slowly enough so nobody would ask questions. In the letter, she begged Jacob to be careful, but to make sure the truth came out. She had hidden all the proof. She told him not to let those men win, to take care of their little girl, Lucy. Elena's hands shook as she finished reading. Tears streamed down Jacob's face. "They murdered her," he whispered, his voice raw with pain. "They killed my wife, and I did nothing." He slammed his fist on the trunk. "I should have known. She should have been able to tell me, and I should have been able to protect her." Lightning flashed, lighting up his broken face. The storm broke right over them, the rain so loud they could barely hear each other think. "We have to show this to someone," Elena said. "Who?" Jacob shot back, his voice bitter. "The sheriff? The judge? They're all in on it. There is nobody we can trust." He looked panicked, his fear for his daughter warring with his anger. "So we do nothing?" Elena's voice rose. "We let them get away with murder? You told me you would not let them win. Doing nothing is letting them win." She stepped closer. "I know what it is like to have the whole system turned against you. I know how it feels to be destroyed by lies. And I'm telling you, the only thing worse than fighting and losing is not fighting at all." The rain hammered on the roof. Jacob stared at her, the truth of her words sinking in. He carefully wrapped the papers back in the oilskin. Down in the barn, he stood clutching the bundle, looking lost. Elena went to him. "You were right," he said, his voice tired. "Margaret died trying to do the right thing. I have spent 3 years being afraid to finish her work." He looked at Elena, his fear still plain on his face. "But they will come after Lucy. I cannot lose her too." Elena put a hand on his arm. "Or she will grow up knowing her father was a hero. You are not alone in this anymore, Jacob." He looked at her then, truly seeing the partnership she was offering. "This is not your fight," he said. "Why would you risk it?" She shook her head. "Maybe it is. When they came for me, I was all alone. No one stood by me. I will not let that happen to you." Jacob tucked the papers inside his shirt. "All right. We have to be smart about this," he said, his voice steady now. "We cannot just walk in and hand this over. They would bury it, and then they would bury us." He was thinking clearly now. "We need to make copies. Get the story to many people at once so they cannot silence it. There is an independent newspaper in Laramie. If we can get a reporter to look into this, they cannot ignore it." That storm gave Coleman and Porter time, and Jacob knew they were running out of it. He paced the barn, nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. "We need to get the upper hand on them," he said, "something that forces their play." Elena's mind was turning, and then it hit her. The Territorial Attorney General's office. "They are in Cheyenne," she said. "Appointed by Washington, so they are not in Porter's pocket." But Cheyenne was a hard 2-day ride, 3 if the weather held foul, and one of them had to stay with Lucy to keep things looking normal. "I will go," Elena said flatly. Jacob stopped dead in his tracks. "What?" "I will take the evidence. To Porter, I am just hired help. If I disappear for a few days, he will just think I finally drifted on." The plan felt right to Elena, even as she said it, but Jacob saw the risk clear as day. "You leave right after we found this, and they will know something is wrong. They will move on us before you can get there." Elena looked him square in the eye. "I have spent 6 years making sure people do not notice me. I know how to disappear." Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the rafters. "Let me help you finish what Margaret started." Jacob's face was a battlefield of worry and desperation. He needed justice, but he could not stand to lose someone else he cared about. The unspoken truth hung there between them. Just then, the big barn doors burst open. Lucy ran in, soaked through and scared to death, with Sarah right behind her. "Daddy!" Lucy cried, throwing herself at Jacob. "The creek's rising. Miss Sarah says we might flood." In that instant, the schemes and dangers fell away, and Jacob was just a father. "Everybody in the house now," he commanded. "We will ride this out together." They dashed through the sheets of rain. Inside, as they stripped off wet coats, Elena saw Jacob shoot a look toward where the evidence was hidden. He had a storm outside his door, and another one gathering that threatened to take everything he had left. The evening passed in a quiet tension. Sarah made stew on the stove while the storm raged. After Lucy finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah gave Jacob and Elena a knowing look. "I can see it on both your faces," she said quietly. "Whatever you are fixing to do, you be smart about it. That child has been through enough." When she left, they sat by the fire, the portfolio on the table between them like a silent judge. Finally, Elena broke the silence. "When should I leave?" Jacob did not argue, he just nodded. "Tomorrow, as soon as this rain breaks." He laid out the plan. He would pack supplies and give her money for the journey. "There is a boarding house in Cheyenne run by a good woman, a Mrs. Chen. Tell her I sent you." "And when I get to the Attorney General?" she asked. "You tell them the truth," Jacob said, his voice hard as iron. "All of it. Tell them Margaret's story. Make them understand this is about murder and corruption that goes all the way to the top. You make them care." He looked at his sleeping daughter. "We do not stop trying, not after what Margaret sacrificed." In the gray, wet light of dawn, Elena was already awake, her mind on the long road ahead. In the kitchen, Jacob had a pack ready: dried meat, hardtack, and a leather pouch heavy with more money than she had seen in 6 years. "You will need it," he said, his voice rough from a sleepless night. He handed her the oilcloth-wrapped evidence. It felt as heavy as a life. "The Attorney General's office is on Capitol Avenue. Ask for Vincent Morrison. He is the chief investigator, and they say he has not been bought yet. Talk to him and nobody else." He stopped, struggling for words. Elena, if there is any trouble at all. He could not finish, but she understood. You have to go, Jacob said, his voice tight. Drop everything and get out of here. The evidence is important, but not as important as... He didn't have to finish. Elena knew he meant you. Just then Sarah stood in the doorway holding Lucy's small hand. The little girl's eyes were red and puffy, her face set in that heartbreaking way kids have when they are trying their best to be brave. You're really leaving? Lucy's voice was a tiny, wounded whisper. Elena knelt down to look the child in the eyes. This was the little girl who had changed her whole world with one simple question just 3 weeks before. Only for a few days, honey. I need to go to Cheyenne and handle something. But you're coming back? The hope in that question was almost too much to bear. Elena looked up at Jacob and he gave a tiny nod, giving her permission to make a promise that might be impossible to keep. I'm coming back, Elena swore, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. I promise. Lucy threw her little arms around Elena's neck, holding on with all her might. Elena hugged her back, breathing in that warm, sleepy kid smell. Be safe, Lucy whispered. I will. Jacob had saddled up a sturdy bay mare, one of his best. Elena secured her small bag, making sure the portfolio was tucked safely inside her coat, and swung up into the saddle. A chill mist hung heavy over the fields. Jacob handed her the reins, his hand covering hers for just a second. 2 days to get there, 1 day to plead your case, and 2 days back. If you ain't here in 6 days, I'm coming for you. Don't, she said firmly. If I'm not back, you have to protect Lucy. That is what matters most. Promise me, Jacob. He clenched his jaw, but nodded. Ride safe. Watch out for washouts from the storm. She nudged the horse forward, glancing back one last time. Jacob stood tall and tense, with Sarah beside him, looking worried. Little Lucy was waving with one hand, her other hand clutching her daddy's leg. Elena burned that picture into her memory, something to hold on to when the road got lonely and long. The first day was slow going. The roads were a mess of mud and water from the storm. She passed by ranches where families were already starting to fix the damage. She kept her head low and spoke to no one, moving like a shadow. It was a skill she had perfected over 6 long years of being an outcast. By that afternoon, she was 20 miles from the Hale Ranch. The country started to get more settled as she neared the main road to Cheyenne. More people meant more chances of someone recognizing her. More risk that word would get back to Porter about a woman riding alone with a fire in her eyes. She stopped at a creek to let the horse drink while she ate some dried meat Jacob had packed. She pulled out the portfolio one more time just to be sure the papers were still dry and safe. The documents were all there, a damning testament to the truth. She reread Margaret's journal, her heart aching at how the handwriting went from strong and sure to shaky and desperate near the end. The final entry was dated 3 days before Margaret died. It took Elena a moment to make out the words. They know, it read. Coleman came today. He brought the tea and watched me drink it. I'm so tired. I can feel the poison. I don't have much time left. I have moved the evidence one last time to a place they will never look. A place Jacob will find when he's ready. I wish I could see Lucy one more time. I wish I could tell Jacob I love him. The last lines were barely a scribble. I'm so sorry for bringing this trouble to our family. I think this is my last night. I tried to do the right thing. I love my family. I hope it was enough. Elena's hands trembled as she put the journal away. Margaret knew she was being murdered. She knew her killers would get away with it. But she hid the evidence anyway, praying that one day someone would find it and have the courage to use it. Now that someone was Elena, a convicted thief, riding toward a city full of powerful men who would do anything to keep the truth buried. The whole situation was just crazy. She got back on the horse and pushed on, trying to cover as much ground as she could before nightfall. She had to get to Cheyenne by the next afternoon. She had to deliver the proof while she still had the nerve to see this insane plan through. As the sun began to set, she started looking for a place to make camp. She preferred the side of the road to a warm bed. Paying for a room meant talking to people, and people have memories. It was better to stay hidden, forgotten. Suddenly, the sound of hoofbeats behind her shattered the quiet. Elena spun around in the saddle. Two riders were coming up on her, and they were coming fast. But they were moving too fast to be simple travelers. Her stomach clenched when she recognized the younger man. He was the deputy who came out to the Hale Ranch with Sheriff Porter. She had only a moment to think. If she ran, they would know she was guilty. If she stayed, she had to hope they were just passing by. But they made the choice for her, pulling their horses up on either side and trapping her. The deputy's smile was cold as ice. "Well now," he said. "Going somewhere in a hurry, are you?" "Looking for work," Elena said, her voice steady, the voice of a woman with no secrets. "That's funny. Sheriff Porter thought you might try something foolish. He told us to watch the roads, just in case Jacob Hale's new helper took a little trip." The older man, with a face like worn leather, nudged his horse closer. "What's in that pack, sweetheart?" "Clothes and food. Nothing that's your business. Everything on this road is our business. Now you can hand that pack over nice and quiet, or we can take it from you." Elena's mind raced. The portfolio was in the pack. If they found it, Margaret's sacrifice would be for nothing. But she could not fight them. She reached for the pack, moving slow, trying to buy another second to think. The older man's hand rested on his pistol, watching her every move. "Easy does it," the deputy warned. "Just give it here, and we'll let you be on your way." It was a lie. Elena heard it in his voice. She saw it in the way they had her cornered. They were not going to let her leave. She knew their secrets, and that made her a danger to them. So she did the only thing she could. She kicked her horse, the mare, with all her might, yanked the reins hard to the left, and bolted. They started shouting behind her. The mare leaped forward with a burst of speed Elena never knew she had. A gunshot cracked the air right beside her ear. She hugged the mare's neck, pushing her faster, steering them off the road and into the rough country where their big horses would struggle. Behind her, the men were cussing and getting their horses under control. The chase was on. The world turned into a blur of rock and sagebrush. The setting sun painted the whole sky blood red. The mare's hooves beat a rhythm that matched Elena's pounding heart. Run, run, run. A wide creek, swollen with recent rain, appeared right in front of them. Elena aimed straight for it, praying the mare could make the jump. The horse gathered her legs and soared. For a single perfect second, they were flying. They landed hard on the other side. The mare stumbled but found her footing and kept running into the growing twilight. Elena risked a look back. The two men were stuck at the edge of the creek. Their horses refused to jump. The deputy was yelling and pointing down the creek, looking for a place to cross. She had bought herself a few minutes, maybe less. She pushed the mare onward, hating to do it, but knowing their lives depended on it. As the light faded, she saw a dark line of trees ahead. She aimed for the woods, hoping to find cover in the darkness. They plunged into the trees, and branches whipped at her face. The portfolio was pressed against her ribs like a second heart. She rode until the mare was gasping for air and stumbling with every step. She knew the good horse had nothing left to give. She slid off the saddle in a small clearing, her own legs shaking. The mare stood with her head hung low, covered in sweat. Elena quickly took off the saddle and rubbed the horse down with dry grass, trying to cool her off. Then she heard voices in the distance. They were still out there, hunting for her. She led the mare deeper into the trees, trying to be as quiet as a ghost. Every broken twig made her heart stop. She found a small dip in the ground, hidden by thick bushes. It was not much, but it would have to be their hiding spot. She settled the mare down and pulled out the portfolio. If they found her, she had to make sure the evidence did not die with her. Elena searched around in a panic, looking for a place to hide it. A tall tree, split by lightning, stood nearby. Its trunk was hollowed out. She checked it for critters, then stuffed the portfolio deep inside. She covered the hole with loose bark and leaves. She memorized the spot, the 3 small trees beside it, and the big rock shaped like a bear. If she did not survive, she needed Jacob to be able to find it. The voices got closer. Elena hurried back to the mare and pressed herself against the animal's warm body. She held her breath and waited in the dark. Footsteps. A branch snapped. A voice said, "She came this way. I know it." Another voice answered, "It's too dark. We will never find her tonight." The first man spoke again. Porter said to bring her back, or don't come back at all. After a long silence, one of them said, "We will camp here. We will start again at first light. That horse of hers is worn out. We will find her tomorrow." Relief and fear fought inside Elena's chest. She was safe until dawn. She waited until the woods were completely silent. Then she carefully led the mare away from the hollow, walking in the opposite direction of the men. She put as much distance as she could between herself and them. She walked all through the night, leading the exhausted horse. Her feet were sore and blistered inside her boots, but she kept going. Stopping meant giving up, and giving up meant Margaret's truth would stay buried forever. When the sun finally came up, cold and gray, Elena had gone maybe 5 miles. It was not enough. The mare could not go any farther. Elena knew she had to do something they would not expect. She hurried back to the lightning-struck tree and pulled out the portfolio. She made it back to her hiding spot without being seen. She opened the wrapping. She could not carry all of it. It was just too big. But she could carry the most important parts. Elena chose the papers that would do the most damage. The fake land deeds, the letters proving the conspiracy, and Margaret's journal. She folded them small, tucked them inside her dress against her skin, and then buried the rest of the papers under a large, odd-shaped rock. She took one last look at the mare, then set off on foot alone. She was ripping a piece from her petticoat for the mare's wounded leg when she heard them, men's voices far too close. She saw fresh tracks in the dirt and her blood ran cold. She had only seconds. She grabbed the reins, knowing it was hopeless but ready to run anyway. Just then, the deputy pushed through the brush. He had his gun out and a smug look on his face. "This is the end of the road, darling. Where is the evidence?" Elena stood her ground, keeping the horse between them. "I do not know what you are talking about. Do not play dumb. We know Hale gave you something to take to Cheyenne. Hand it over, and we might just let you go." She knew that was a lie. "I burned it," she said. "I burned every last page last night when I knew you were on my trail." His face twisted with rage. "You are lying. Am I? Go on and search me. Search the horse. You will not find a thing because there is nothing left." She stared right at him, her voice steady. "Whatever you think Jacob had, it is all just ashes now." He studied her, trying to see the truth. Elena did not even breathe. The papers hidden in her dress felt like they were on fire. "We will just see about that," he said with a scowl. He motioned with his gun. "Start walking back to the road. If you try anything, I will shoot the horse first. I will make you watch her suffer before I take care of you." As she walked, Elena's mind raced. The deputy was right behind her, and his partner joined them from the trees. It was her against 2 armed men. Things looked mighty grim. They were about halfway to the road when help arrived from out of nowhere. A lone rider appeared on the ridge above them, clear against the morning sun. Then another and 3 more after that. They were all armed, and all wore the badges of territorial marshals. The deputy let out a vicious curse. "What in the world are they doing out here?" His partner was starting to panic. "Someone must have called for them. We have to get out of here." But they turned their horses and vanished into the woods. Elena was left standing there with her trembling mare as the marshals rode down the hill to meet her. The man in the lead was older, probably in his 50s, with a face that had seen years of tough justice. He got off his horse slowly, looking her over. "Are you all right, miss?" Elena's voice was shaky when she answered. "Yes, I am. Thank you. We have been tracking those 2 since yesterday. We heard there might be some trouble on this road." His eyes narrowed just a bit. "I do not suppose you would know anything about that?" In that instant, Elena made a choice. She reached into her dress and pulled out the folded papers. She held them out to the marshal with a trembling hand. "My name is Elena Cross. I am carrying evidence of land theft and murder. I was on my way to the Attorney General in Cheyenne when those men attacked. She looked him square in the eye. I need to get this to Vincent Morrison right away. The marshal took the documents and began to read. His expression went from doubtful to shocked and then to a grim resolve. When he looked up, his voice was like iron. Miss Cross, my name is Marshal Thomas Webb. I am not related to the judge in these papers, if you are wondering. I think we need to have a long talk about what you have found. Elena felt a wave of relief so strong her knees almost buckled. Can you get me to Morrison? Can you make sure he gets this? I can do better than that. Morrison is in Laramie right now, just a 2-hour ride from here. Webb turned to his men. Collins, you take Miss Cross's horse back to town and get her cared for. Davidson, you ride hard for Laramie. Tell Morrison we are bringing him something he needs to see now. The rest of you ride with me and Miss Cross. We are taking her somewhere safe. As they rode, Elena started to hope that Margaret's death would not be for nothing. Vincent Morrison was a sharp man with steel gray hair and eyes that saw everything. He sat with Elena in a small office in Laramie. The evidence she brought was spread all over his desk. For 2 hours he read, while Elena told him the whole story. She told him about Jacob's long search for the truth about his wife, and about Margaret's secret journal. She explained how she found the papers hidden in a quilt, and how she fled from the men who were trying to silence her for good. Morrison finally put down the last page of the journal. He leaned back, his face set like stone. This is the kind of evidence that destroys careers and puts men in prison for life. He looked at Elena with a newfound respect. Mrs. Hale was very thorough. She was dying, Elena said softly. She knew she had to be. Will it be enough? Enough to start an investigation? Without a doubt. We will need more to get convictions, of course. We will need testimony from the families who lost their land, and we will need to check bank records. But yes, Miss Cross, this is more than enough to burn their whole scheme to the ground. Tears of relief welled up in Elena's eyes. How long will it take? Until they are all arrested. Until Jacob and Lucy are truly safe. Morrison's look softened just a little. I can have warrants ready in 24 hours. We will move fast and arrest them all at the same time. That will give them no chance to hide evidence or get their stories straight, but he paused. You need to understand they will use your past against you in court. They will try to make you look like a liar. I do not care what they try to do, Elena said. I only care that Margaret gets justice. Then we are on the same side, Morrison said. Marshal Webb will take you back to Ridgefield. I want you to stay safe until the arrests are made. Then you will have to give a formal statement. Elena nodded, the exhaustion of the past few days finally hitting her. She had been through so much, but underneath the weariness was a deep satisfaction. She had kept her promise. She had finished what Margaret started. Marshal Webb rode with her on the way back. His steady presence was a comfort. When they finally saw the Hale Ranch in the distance, bathed in the late afternoon sun, Elena felt something in her chest loosen. It felt like coming home. Jacob must have been watching the road because he was running toward them before they even reached the house. His face was a mix of terror and pure relief. Elena slid off her horse, and he was there, his hands on her shoulders. You are alive. You are safe. I was so worried when you did not return. His voice cracked. I am all right, Jacob. And it is done. The evidence is with the Attorney General. They are getting the warrants ready right now. Elena watched the news sink in. She saw 6 years of pain and helplessness finally begin to break. They are going to arrest them? Jacob asked, his voice shaking. Porter, Coleman, all of them? They are going to pay for what they did to Margaret. He pulled her into a hug so tight she could hardly breathe. Over his shoulder she saw little Lucy running from the house with Sarah right behind her. Lucy threw her arms around both of their legs. You came back! You promised you would. Elena knelt and hugged the little girl. I told you I would. Did you do that important thing you had to do? Yes, sweetheart. I did it. Sarah came closer, her tough expression not quite hiding the shine in her eyes. Well, I reckon you two will be wanting some supper. It was the kindest thing Sarah could say, and it made Elena smile. That sounds perfect. Marshal Webb tipped his hat but said he could not stay. I will be back tomorrow with Morrison and the warrants. Until then, you all should stay close to home. Home. Once word gets out, there will be questions, reporters, and a whole mess of lawyers. Best we stay ready. After he left, they all went inside. Sarah had clearly been cooking her worries away. The table was covered with enough food to feed a whole ranch crew. They sat down, and Elena discovered she was starving, eating with a purpose while Lucy chattered on about everything she missed. Daddy was worried sick, Lucy said, plain as day. He kept pacing at night, looking out the windows. Miss Sarah said he was being a fool and that you could handle yourself, but he did it anyway. Jacob looked a little sheepish. I was not worried. I was just concerned. You barely slept a wink, Sarah chimed in. Wore a groove in the floor with all your pacing. Across the table, Elena met Jacob's eyes. She saw the relief that had replaced his worry, and something more that neither of them was ready to put a name on. After Lucy was tucked into bed, Jacob and Elena found themselves back on the porch, falling into that familiar quiet as the stars began to pop out overhead. Tell me everything that happened, Jacob said softly. So she did. She told him about the chase, jumping the creek, and hiding while Porter's men searched for her. She described how the marshal showed up like an answered prayer, and how Morrison was determined to see this through. When she was done, Jacob was quiet for a long spell. They could have killed you. They could have put you in the ground, and nobody would have ever known. But they did not, she said. And Margaret's story is finally going to be told. Because of you, his voice was heavy. Because you risked it all for folks you barely knew. For a woman you never even met. For a kind of justice you had no reason to believe in anymore. I did it because it was the right thing to do, Elena started, choosing her words with care. And because y'all gave me something I thought I'd lost for good. A reason to believe that fighting for the truth matters. That there are still good people in this world. Jacob reached out and took her hand. You are part of this family now. Whether you planned on it or not, you belong here. Lucy adores you. Sarah respects you, and I... He struggled for a moment. I do not want you to leave when this is done. I want you to stay. Not as hired help, but as part of this place. As family. Elena felt her throat tighten. Jacob, you do not have to answer now. I know it is complicated. But I needed you to know that when the dust settles, there is a place for you here, if you want it. She wanted to say yes right then and there. But 6 years of looking over her shoulder held her back. Hope was a dangerous thing. Let's just get through tomorrow first, she said at last. Let's see this to the end. He nodded, but did not let go of her hand. The morning came slow and fast all at once. You could feel the tension in the air. Lucy stayed close to Elena, quiet as a mouse. Sarah went about her chores, but her hands trembled just a little when she poured the coffee. The lawman arrived just before noon. Morrison and another marshal, with 6 federal agents backing them up, all armed and serious. Morrison walked up to the porch like a man about to move a mountain. It is time, he said. The warrants are signed. We are making arrests within the hour. I need you all to stay put until we have them in custody. After that, Miss Cross, I will need your formal statement in town. What about Jacob? Elena asked. He saw what happened to Margaret. Mr. Hale will be called to testify, yes. But the main evidence is from the papers you brought us. Morrison's eyes were like steel. We are charging Coleman and Porter with conspiracy, fraud, extortion, and murder. Judge Webb is facing corruption charges, too. If they are convicted, they will get life in prison, maybe even hang for the murder. Jacob's hand found hers and squeezed. This was it. Justice for Margaret. There is one more thing, Morrison said, his voice a bit softer. Miss Cross, I have been looking into your case from 6 years ago. The family that accused you of theft. Their lawyer was Coleman, the judge was Webb, and the sheriff who arrested you was the man Porter replaced right after you were convicted. It hit Eleanor like a physical blow. They framed me, my conviction. It was all them. I believe so. You turned down that family's son, so they decided to ruin you. It was a test, you see. If they could successfully frame an innocent woman, they could do it to anyone who got in the way of their land scheme. Morrison looked at her with real sympathy. This means we can get your conviction overturned. You can get your name back, Miss Cross. Your freedom. Everything they stole from you. Jacob's arm wrapped around her, holding her steady. Everything? She whispered. Including your father's land. The sale was illegal. It is still yours. It was always yours. The lawmen rode off, leaving Elena in the yard with the truth of it all crashing down on her. 6 years. 6 years of running and shame, believing she was ruined forever, and it was all a lie cooked up by evil men. She was crying before she even realized it. Lucy's small hand slipped into hers. "Why are you sad?" the little girl asked. "They are going to catch the bad men. Is that not good?" "It is good, sweetheart. These are happy tears." Elena hugged her close. Sometimes folks cry when something that was broken gets fixed. They waited. The hours crawled by. Sarah made a lunch that nobody could eat. Jacob paced the floor just like he had before. Finally, a rider brought the news. The arrests were made. Porter, Coleman, and Webb were in custody and on their way to Cheyenne. Jacob drove them into town in the wagon. The whole place was buzzing. People were gathered in the streets, talking in shocked voices. The diner owner who had thrown Elena out just days before saw her and went quiet, a look of shame on her face. Elena just held her head high and walked right on by. Morrison had set up at the town hall where the families who had lost their land were already gathering. They were weathered, hard-working folks who looked at Elena with a fragile, cautious hope. Morrison introduced her. "This is Elena Cross. She is the woman whose courage is bringing your tormentors to justice." An old man stepped up, twisting his hat in his hands. "They took my family's homestead. 3 generations on that land, and they stole it with forged papers. My wife died thinking we had failed." Tears streamed down his face. "Are you telling me it was not our fault?" "You did not fail," Elena said, her voice strong and clear for everyone to hear. "They were criminals who used the law like a weapon. None of what happened was your fault." One after another, the families stood up and told their stories. They spoke of stolen land, ruined lives, and a justice they never thought they would see. Elena listened to every word, and the lawyer Morrison wrote it all down. He was building a case so strong that no one could ignore it. When they were finally done, the sun was going down. But Elena had helped give these folks something precious. She gave them hope. Morrison walked with her to the wagon where Jacob was waiting. "The trial will start in about 6 weeks," he said. "I will need you to testify, to tell the jury what you found." "I will be ready," she said. "Good." Morrison held out his hand. "Miss Cross, what you did was braver than anything I have ever seen. This territory owes you more than we can ever pay." Elena shook his hand and then climbed into the wagon next to Jacob. Lucy was fast asleep in the back. They rode back to the ranch under a blanket of stars. At home, everything felt the same, but it was all different now. A long shadow had finally lifted. The fight was over, and justice, a long time coming, was finally here. After Lucy was asleep and Sarah had turned in, Elena found Jacob out on their porch. It was their place for the talks that mattered. "It's really done," she said, sitting down beside him. "They're going to prison. Margaret's death is finally being called a murder, and those families are getting their land back. Everything she died for is happening because of you." Jacob shook his head. "You risked everything to finish it." "We all did," she said. "We did it together." Jacob turned to her, his face serious in the moonlight. "Elena, I've got to ask you something, and I need a straight answer." She nodded. "Now that your name is cleared, and you're getting your father's land back, are you leaving? Are you going back to Colorado?" It was the one question she'd been dreading. For 6 long years, her life was about what she'd lost. Now, her father's farm in Colorado was hers again. But the thought of leaving the Hale Ranch, of leaving Jacob, Lucy, and Sarah, made her heart ache. "That land was my father's dream," she said, speaking slowly. "Getting it back means the world. But I'm not the same girl who lived there 6 years ago. Home isn't just land anymore. It's the people who make you feel you belong." "So what are you saying?" Elena took a steadying breath. "I'm saying I could sell that land and put the money into this ranch, to make it grow and secure Lucy's future. I'm saying I could build a life right here, if that's what you want, if there's a place for me in this family." Jacob's hand found hers in the dark. "There's been a place for you since the day Lucy brought you home." He finally looked at her. "Elena, I love you. I need you to know that. If you stay, it won't be as hired help. It'll be as my partner, as my wife, if you'll have me, and as Lucy's mother, if you're willing." Tears welled in Elena's eyes. "You're asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking you to stop running," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm asking you to build a life with us. Please, stay." She looked at this good man who had lost so much but still chose to hope, who had taken in a stranger just because his daughter asked. All the reasons to say no faded away. "Yes," she whispered, the word full of a surprising strength. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes to all of it." He pulled her close and kissed her, a kiss that washed away 6 years of loneliness. "Lucy's gonna lose her mind," Elena said, breathless, resting her head against his. Jacob laughed, a sound full of relief. "She'll probably say she knew it all along." They sat there under the stars, planning a future that had once seemed impossible. They would marry after the trial. They'd use the money from her father's land to expand the ranch, and maybe they'd give Lucy some brothers and sisters. At the trial, Morrison laid out the case plain and simple. Elena testified for 2 days, her voice never wavering as she told the jury about Margaret's journal and her escape. The defense lawyers tried to paint her as a liar, but Morrison shut down their arguments one by one. He proved her conviction was a setup and brought in expert after expert. The jury only needed 3 hours. They came back with guilty verdicts for everyone. Judge Webb got life in prison, Coleman got 25 years, and Porter got life for murder. Watching them being led away in chains, Elena felt a quiet peace. Justice, even when it's slow, is still justice. Back in Ridgefield, the town that had once turned its back on her, now treated her with a newfound respect. The wedding was small and just right. Sarah handled everything, and Lucy scattered wildflowers down the aisle. Jacob and Elena said their vows on the porch, the very spot where they learned to trust each other. Lucy stood right between them, holding both of their hands, making them a family for real. That night, Elena looked at herself in the mirror. The hardship of the past 6 years was still etched on her face, but the woman looking back wasn't broken anymore. She was home. A soft knock came at the door. It was Lucy, already in her nightgown. "Can I come in?" "Of course, sweetheart." The little girl climbed onto the bed. "Elena," she asked seriously, "can I call you Mama now? Or is that wrong since I already had a Mama?" Elena's heart swelled. "You had a wonderful Mama who loved you more than anything," she said gently, "and you should never, ever forget her. But I think she would want you to have someone here to love you now. If you want to call me Mama, it would be the greatest honor of my life. I love you, Lucy." Lucy threw her arms around Elena's neck. "I love you too, Mama. I'm so glad you stayed." "Me too, sweetheart," Elena whispered, holding her tight. "Me too." Life on the ranch found a new, happy rhythm. Elena sold the Colorado land, and they invested every penny back into their home. hiring a couple of ranch hands and building a new barn. The ranch prospered. Lucy grew up tall and confident, loved by two parents. She rode like the wind and never stopped asking questions. Sarah stayed on, keeping them all in line, a quiet contentment on her face. And Jacob, the weight he had carried for so long, finally lifted. He smiled more, laughed freely, and loved his new wife with all his heart. They had built a life on the ashes of the old one, a life full of hope and hard work, a testament to the fact that family is something you build, not just something you're born into. He laughed more and smiled more often. He would hold Elena close at night and tell her she had saved him in more ways than she would ever know. On the anniversary of Margaret's death, the four of them, Jacob, Elena, Lucy, and Sarah, went to visit her grave. They brought flowers from the garden Margaret herself had planted. Lucy set them gently on the headstone. "Thank you," Jacob said softly, speaking to the woman he had lost. "Thank you for being so brave and for leaving us the truth. You saved more than just our ranch, Margaret. You saved all of us." Elena said her own silent prayer of thanks. "Thank you for raising a daughter who could see the good in a stranger. Thank you for loving a man who knew how to honor your memory by building a beautiful future." They stood there together in the Wyoming sunshine. They were a family made from loss and courage, a family who chose to believe in goodness when the world gave them every reason not to. As they walked back to the wagon, Lucy held both their hands, swinging between them. Elena thought about the woman she used to be 6 years ago. She had been young and scared, convicted of a crime she did not commit. That woman had learned to survive by running away. For years, she believed that being safe meant being alone and invisible, always one step ahead of the trouble that was chasing her. But the woman Elena had become knew better. She knew that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is to just stop running. Sometimes you have to let yourself be found by a little barefoot girl with too much trust in her heart. Sometimes you have to choose to stay, even when leaving feels like the only safe option. Sometimes you have to fight for what is right, even when you have been taught that the fight is rigged against you. Her name was Elena Hale now. She was a wife, a mother, and a rancher. She was the woman who had exposed a corrupt plot and won her good name back. But more than all of that, she was someone who had finally learned that home is not a place you run back to. Home is something you build piece by piece with the people who believe you deserve a place to stay. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.